Windows 95 shipped on August 24, 1995, and Auto Run came with it. It was a feature built entirely around reducing friction. Microsoft wanted computers to feel approachable, especially for people who were not comfortable at the command line. The idea was straightforward. When optical media is inserted, Windows checks for a small configuration file called autorun.inf. If that file is present and points to an executable, Windows runs it automatically. Disk goes in, installer opens. For the consumer market of the mid-1990s, that mattered. But there was something embedded in that design that was not wildly examined at the time. Windows was not just reading the disk, it was handing control of the machine to whatever instructions the disk carried. The act of physical insertion became a kind of implicit permission. The operating system had no way to distinguish between a disk you trusted and one you didn't. Both would run equally. That architectural assumption stayed in place for a decade, and in 2005, it got tested in a way no one in the music industry probably intended. Sony BGM was trying to stop people from ripping and copying their CDs. They licensed a copy protection system called XCP, developed by a UK firm called First for Internet. The idea was to embed software on music CDs that would control how discs could be used on a Windows machine. When someone inserted one of the CDs on a Windows PC, the Auto Run feature launched the XCP installer automatically. Users were presented with a license agreement. If they accepted, software was installed. What that software actually did was not disclosed in any meaningful way. On October 31, 2005, Mark Rusinovich, then at SysInternals, discovered it while running Rootkit Revealer, a rootkit detection tool he had co-developed with Bryce Cogswell. The software had installed a kernel-level rootkit. It used a cloaking technique that made any file or process whose name started with the prefix $sys$ completely invisible to the operating system and to any application asking Windows about running processes. The rootkit loaded at boot time before most of the system was even ready, and critically, it opened a channel that other malware could exploit. Any attacker who knew about the prefix could hide their own code using the same hiding mechanism Sony had installed. On NPR Morning Edition, November 4, 2005, Thomas Hesse, Sony BMG's president of global digital business, responded to the growing scandal with a line that became infamous in security circles. He said, "Most people, I think, don't even know what a rootkit is, so why should they care about it?" Security professionals had a different view. The U.S. CERT issued an advisory. Texas filed the first state-level lawsuit under spyware law. Estimates put the number of affected machines at over 500,000 before the disclosure became public. Sony eventually recalled the CDs. What the XCP incident demonstrated was not just a corporate misstep. It showed that the Auto Run trust model had no boundary condition. A music CD was not supposed to be a software delivery mechanism. But Windows did not know that. Physical insertion was physical insertion. The next expansion of that problem came when USB drives became common. USB flash storage changed the scale of removable media entirely. A CD you had to go buy, press, and ship. A USB drive could be loaded in seconds, left on a table, mailed, handled by someone, or dropped in a parking lot. The surface area of the same basic attack grew by orders of magnitude. Windows extended auto-run behavior to USB drives. The same autorun.inf mechanism that had worked for optical media now applied to any removable storage that Windows recognized. The physical insertion model had traveled from the optical drive bay to your pocket. In late 2008, a worm called Conficker appeared. Its initial vector was a known vulnerability in the Windows Server Service, tracked as MS-08067. Microsoft had released a patch, but enormous numbers of machines were unpatched. Conficker spread through network exploitation, through weak administrator passwords over SMB, and through removable drives. The B variant dropped a copy of itself into the recycle bin of any attached USB drive, then wrote an autorun.inf pointing to it. Plug that drive into another machine with autorun enabled, and the worm executed automatically. No user interaction required. By January 2009, estimates of infected machines ran between 9 and 15 million. Security organizations around the world coordinated to track command and control infrastructure. The US CERT explicitly told users that disabling autorun was one of the direct ways to cut Conficker's USB propagation channel. Microsoft eventually responded with structural changes. Windows 7 shipped with autorun disabled by default for USB drives and external storage devices. The behavior was also backported to Windows XP and Vista via updates. Autoplay, the dialogue that asked users what to do when media was connected, still worked for optical discs, but autorun, the silent automatic execution, no longer fired for flash drives and external hard drives. The infected USB social engineering threat that Conficker had exploited at scale was specifically what Microsoft cited when making these changes. But disabling autorun did not mean that removable media had been neutralized as a threat vector. Stuxnet made that clear. Stuxnet appeared around 2010. It was not a mass-spreading, opportunistic worm. It was a targeted weapon. Its goal was to reach the programmable logic controllers at Iran's Natanz uranium enrichment facility, machines that ran Siemens Step 7 software and controlled centrifuges physically spinning enriched uranium. That facility was air-gapped, no internet connection, no remote access. To get malware into that environment, you needed someone to physically carry it in. USB drives were that bridge. Early Stuxnet variants used an autorun.inf file as one propagation method, but the version that reached Natanz did not depend on it. That version exploited CVE 2010-2568, a vulnerability in how Windows Shell handled shortcut files, the .link extension. When a user simply opened a folder on an infected drive in Windows Explorer, the operating system attempted to render shortcut icons. That rendering process called a function that loaded Stuxnet's DLL automatically. No click required, no prompt. Just viewing the drive's contents was enough. Microsoft had patched autorun behavior. Stuxnet worked around that by targeting a different layer of the same underlying assumption, that displaying content from removable media was safe. Once inside a network, Stuxnet was dormant unless it found Siemens Step 7 software. When it did, it intercepted communications between the engineering workstation and the PLCs, fed false data back to monitoring systems so operators saw normal readings, while simultaneously issuing modified commands to the centrifuges that pushed them outside safe operating parameters. It physically destroyed hardware through software. The facility reported unexplained centrifuge failures. The malware had achieved physical effects through a chain that started with a USB drive carried through a gate by a person. Autorun is a solved problem now, in the narrow sense. Windows 10 and 11 do not auto-execute code from USB drives. The specific mechanism that Conficker wrote to spread across millions of machines no longer functions by default. But the underlying problem that autorun represented was never purely about optical discs or flash drives. It was about what happens when a system treats content as a command. That boundary problem appears today in a different context. Language models and AI agents can receive input from many sources: documents, emails, web pages, tool outputs, files passed through pipelines. An attacker can embed instructions inside what looks like ordinary content. A PDF that a user asks an assistant to summarize might contain text telling the assistant to take a different action entirely. A web page being retrieved might carry instructions aimed not at the human reader, but at the system doing the retrieval. These are called prompt injection attacks, and the reason they work is structurally similar to the way autorun was a problem. The system cannot reliably distinguish between content it is reading and instructions it is supposed to follow. In 1995, a disk going in and the installer opening felt like progress. The machine was getting out of your way. But what Windows was actually doing was granting trust based on physical proximity, not on any verified intent. It could not tell the difference between a CD-ROM pressed by a software publisher and one pressed by someone who wanted access to your kernel. Every time a system cannot distinguish between data it is processing and commands it is executing, you are looking at a version of the same problem. The threat surface changes, the operating system changes, the media changes, but the question underneath stays the same. How does the machine know the difference between content and commands? With autorun, it turned out the answer was, it did not.